Hi everyone, this is Igor Scarano. We are here today. Today we're doing this in English because we have a special guest. And for those that have not seen any of the videos that we are publishing, we are covering a series. We are doing a series of videos discussing the potential change in the Brazilian transfer pricing rules in the near future, and the project handled by the OECD and the Receita Federal do Brasil. And in this project, we are discussing the future alliance or alignment with the international standards from a Brazilian perspective. So in order to continue with this series, I thought about inviting my friend Fabian, who's here with me. And Fabian is an expert in transfer pricing. I'm gonna let him introduce himself so you know him a little bit more. And after his introduction, we're gonna talk a little bit about the topics we think are interest to you.
Yeah, thank you, Igor, for the invitation. Really glad that we can have this conversation officially. We've been talking a lot about transfer pricing, right? And the future of the Brazilian transfer pricing system. So I'm glad that we have this opportunity to, I guess, express some of our ideas to the public. So in a nutshell, I've been doing transfer pricing for over 17 years, right? I started back in 2004 in Colombia, worked there for about 8 years, and I've been for the past 9 years working from Miami. I specialize in transfer pricing, but specifically I've done most of my career has been focused on Latin American issues. I've helped deploy transfer pricing projects from implementation through documentation throughout the region for many years, basically since I started working on transfer pricing. So I'm quite familiar with the regulations in the region. And yeah, you could say that is one of my specialties. I am now with Duff & Phelps, which is an incredible company. We basically tackle complex issues, providing value to our clients. And we have different areas: valuation, corporate finance, disputes and investigation, cybersecurity. And within our valuation practice, we have our transfer pricing practice, and that's where I rely. And I basically lead our Latin American transfer pricing efforts for Duff & Phelps. Yeah, that's in a nutshell my CV.
Very good, thank you. So I forgot to mention that recently we published an article in Bloomberg Tax. We co-authored with also two other colleagues from Duff & Phelps, Jamie and Salim. It was a very interesting article. So for you guys that haven't read that yet, so I strongly recommend. So a couple of the topics that we are covering today are somehow addressed that as well. So the idea here that I was thinking about is to discuss a little bit more on comparability. So in the project context, we are really sometimes we are talking about how we're going to benchmark transactions in the future if Brazil really aligned with the international standards. So there are people concerned on whether or not we're going to find local comparables, and should we be too concerned about the lack of comparables in Brazil? Should we open a little bit more on the scope and maybe consider regional comparables? What's the point with that? Is it a big problem, a small problem? So I know this is not a new thing in the transfer pricing area. So when I was in Europe, this was also an issue for other countries. So when we are discussing about that topic, Fabian, I recall that you comment about your experience dealing with this particular issue in the region, in many countries in Latin America, and sometimes even in other regions. So I'd like you to, if you could give us a little bit on your perspective regarding this topic, I think is going to be very useful for the audience.
Okay, good. So yeah, I would say that, well, comparability is a really important term in transfer pricing, right? And for OECD purposes, is everything basically. So I would say that it's best to focus on comparability for TNMM purposes. You're right, the transactional net margin method, which is the method that is, I guess, the most used method worldwide. And because of the particularities of the Brazilian market and all that, I would imagine that will be one of the most applied methods in Brazil. So when we're talking about comparability for TNMM purposes, we have, I guess, the first thing is that we have a certain degree of leeway or room to determine what is comparable for TNMM purposes. Because the regulation and the method itself is created to give us this room, right? So if you remember, back in the previous OECD guidelines, the TNMM was actually a method of last resort, right? So once you try it all, then go for the TNMM. That was rephrased in the latest versions of the guidelines, and now it's just like an applicable method, but we've always kept that practice, right? So like it's the last resort method. And back in the day, the point was to allow or permit or create this method that will be kind of like a catch-all method for companies to somehow comply with the arm's length principle, or show, to the tax authorities that they were complying with the arm's length principle. So the comparability issue, I think, is a thing that for TNMM purposes is driven a lot by the practice itself, right? And the practice is built by the government, Receita Federal in this case for Brazil, by the practitioners, so the firms that are doing transfer pricing, and of course by the taxpayers. So these three groups are going to create, for Brazilian purposes, what are going to be the practice standards. And each country has to develop their own transfer pricing standards, including the one for the TNMM. So what I would say as an initial thought is that each country that I've worked with have really engaged in their own comparability standards, right? In Latin America, we have a huge issue with information because, to the contrary of countries like the US or countries in the European Union, where they have abundance of information, public information, in Latin America, we're constrained by that public information, right? So be that public information, for public quoted companies, or private information from, the typical legal entities operating in each one of these countries, right? So we have an issue with the information that is going to be relevant when we're applying the TNMM, which in Brazil, like it is relevant when we apply the TNMM in Mexico, in Colombia, in Chile, Argentina, elsewhere, right? So the practice, these three elements, taxpayers, consultants, and the government will have to determine for Brazilian purposes what are the appropriate standards, right? What are the sources of information that we're going to use, and how are we going to make those quote unquote comparability adjustments, right, to those comparables that we find in the open market, right? So different countries have different ways to go about it. I would say, for example, in the US, the practice is to use public quoted companies, but the most common practice is use public quoted companies. The US, of course, has a really well developed advantage on this area, because we have more than 11,000 companies in the market, right? And why the US has chosen these companies, because you can make different type of analysis that are required to determine this comparability for transfer pricing purposes, right? Being the main one, first, if it's functional comparable, if from a functional perspective is comparable, and that the public companies, they have to disclose annually an annual report. In the US, quarterly reports, presentations. So they have to release a lot of functional information to the market. The more information they release, I guess the more trustable that company is for the market. So that is a source of information that is very valuable for transfer pricing. And that's why I would say a majority of the global practice is based on, for TNMM purposes, once again, is based on public quoted companies. But there are other practices like the European practice that is more focused on the private comparables, as you experience, of course, right?
So Fabian, let me ask you something. Very good conversation. I think one question I have, I don't know if you have that at the top of your mind, but I was thinking about, even in the US, sometimes when you apply the CPM, which is the American version of the TNMM, imagine a situation where the most complex entity is the American one, and the tested party is a distributor in the, let's say, in the Latin American region. So from a American United States perspective, how do you see that tested party in Latin American? Would they the IRS accept like America's region comparables, or would they want to see like a local comparable to test this distributor in Latin America? How do you see that type of structure?
Yeah, well, yeah, I would say two things. Of course, and for people in Brazil that may be listening to this, for transfer pricing purposes, OECD transfer pricing purposes, 482 transfer pricing purposes, which is the US regulation, we've always, when using the CPM or TNMM, we've always aimed to evaluate the less complex entity, right? Which in this case, the one you propose would be the subsidiary in Latin America, right? The regulations in the US are quite specific, and they do require that you make an effort to look for those comparables in the region. If you can get them from that country, is perfect. But at the end of the day, the practice also has recognized that there's a very difficult situation to find a specific country comparables. So in practice, the regulations, or not the regulations, but the tax authorities have shown appreciation to use regional comp sets. For example, in this case, we would work with an Americas comp set, right? Where we would include comparables mainly from the US and Canada, where is most of the available information, but we can find one or two comparables that are local, both in Brazil and Mexico, usually because they're the most developed markets in terms of public companies in the region, right? Okay. There will be a mix like that for US purposes, and actually that's kind of like the trend for the rest of the region in Latin America. Right, so it's not a unique thing. It's not like this is not monolithic. Even within each one of their own tax authorities, it's not a monolithic thought that we need to global regional Americas concept for our tested party with public information. It's not just one point of view. There could be other point of views, but that's the common practice, if I would say.
Great. I'm going to ask you this because, as you know, we are in the situation right now to discuss the future. So, from a tax policy perspective, in Brazil, what I don't want to see, and I think that most of practitioners don't want to see, is like a sort of restriction of using only Brazilian comparables. There are some countries that like to do that type of approach. And I think that it's really not, I would say, something that we look forward. So I really hope that the guys in the projects don't restrict comparability in terms of local comparables. Otherwise, we're gonna be, I would say, in a jeopardy, and because really, it could be the case that it's going to be very difficult to find a local comparable. So I think that that's one thing that I'd like to cover with you, but we are running the time, but I really want to touch base with you about private companies, because in Europe, when I was there, there were like tons of private companies in the benchmarking studies. And I was always concerned when I was reviewing them because there are many of them, they are very small and with very limited information in terms of the assets, risks, functions, and how they really compare, that they are comparable to the tested transaction. So, and in this situation, do you have a specific concern on this practice? How do you see that?
Well, yeah, there will always be a concern with private companies for many reasons. Of course, the functional information is going to be the key element, and I've done my good share of analysis for Europe as well. So, you always have to do a lot of or spend much more time, which will mean money for the taxpayers, looking for those comparables. And at the end, the results, when compared with public companies, are not that materially different. There has been a lot of analysis about this issue, how the public ranges correlate with the private ranges, and at the end of the day, they would be fairly similar. One big advantage is that if, I don't know if this exists currently in Brazil, but if there is a good database where you can obtain good, reliable financial information and some functional information, if you complete that with web research, you may get to a good set of comparables, which of course, because they're in the country, that factor would be more comparable than using American comparables, for example, or Canadian comparables or Mexican comparables. But on the same token, you will lack a lot of this functional information, right? Probably you just get, P&L, you would need balance sheet to make capital adjustments, or maybe the information is too little, or maybe there's no information at all, right? So definitely, if you can get, I guess at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's private or public, but quality of information, and that is accessible for all of the parties, right? Because one thing is that, Receita Federal, they know the information for everyone, but no one else knows that, right? Or have access to that. So that's the limitation, right? And at the end of the day, for certain transactions, you will want to go and look and do these, regional global comp sets for more standardized functions, right? So it depends. It depends. I'm not against it, but definitely when you're auditing comparables, auditing a public company will be as a comparable would be much easier than discarding or accepting a private company.
Very good, Fabian. Of course, that it's a very interesting topic. We could do that. We can talk about it like for hours. But I think that it's better for us to keep it short, yep. And people have access to that type of conversation. Maybe you record another one in the future. So I'd like to thank you very much. You've been very kind to have this conversation with me. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, thank you for the invitation. And of course, it's such a fascinating topic that we could spend hours talking about it. So what I would say to the viewers, if they have any questions, they can reach out to any of us too, and we can continue the conversation privately. So pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.